that we live in a world of what I call three structural contradictions. And these structural contradictions will, I hope, enable you to understand the future better, because you will see on the one side the world getting better, and you will see on the other side very profound, dramatic challenges that humanity is facing. And you've got to understand these contradictions to understand the world that is coming. So let me start with the first contradiction. The first contradiction in our world today is between what I see as the surface bad news and the structural good news. And of course, because newspapers sell, only if they give you bad news. We wake up, our minds are filled with the bad news. It can be about, as I mentioned, the starvation in Gaza, or it can be Trump's latest tariffs. And I can tell you that some of the unhappiest people in the world today live in New Delhi. I mean, look at India. Rising, shining India. In the last 24 hours, they got 3 big slaps from Donald Trump. Shocking, right? But that's a perfect example of the bad news that trumps the good news. Forgive the pun on Trump's. But so when you get absorbed by this surface bad news, you miss the more important structural good news about the human condition. And I'll give you 4 examples. As you know, the first and most important thing about the human condition is that if you want to enjoy the human condition, you got to live. You got to stay alive. And most people are not aware that for most of human history, going back thousands of years, 50% of the population died when they were children. They were lucky if they survived to the age of 15. 50%. Today, that number is down to 4%. And as you know, infant mortality has gone down sharply. Life expectancy has gone up dramatically. And that's the human condition. It is the best time to be born in that sense. And in another dimension, I mentioned wars earlier on. Statistically, the number of people dying from interstate wars is among the lowest it's been since most of human history. And if you have any doubts about this, there's a scholar in Harvard, a psychologist called Steven Pinker, who's written many books giving you the data on how deaths from wars have been going down significantly. But take another human condition. Take poverty. Again, for most of human history, most of humanity lived in poverty. And I can tell you, I can say this with some conviction, because even though today Singapore is a very prosperous, successful society, when I grew up in Singapore in the 1950s and 1960s, Singapore was very poor. Our per capita income was the same as Ghana, $500, and I grew up in a poor family, in a poor Singapore. In fact, when I went to school, at the age of 6, I was put on a special feeding program because I was technically undernourished. Now, as you can see, I'm overnourished. But more than that, I can tell you, when you suffer poverty, it's not just about the physical deprivation. We lived in a house without a flush toilet till I was 13 years old. And I can tell you that one of the most dramatic turning points in my life came when the flush toilet came. That's an amazing change. The stench disappeared, and you lived in a normal life. And that's how the human condition it's been improving. And until as recently as 1990, right, 30% of the world's population was experiencing extreme poverty, about 1.6 billion people. And out of this 1.6 billion people, 1.2 billion of them were in Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, 1.2 billion. That number has gone down from 1.2 billion to 24 million. That's amazing. That's an amazing reduction of poverty in our region in the last 30 years, right? This is the structural good news. And at the same time, as you can see now, I belong to the middle class. The middle class population, especially in Asia, has exploded. Okay, in the year 2000, if you add up the 1.4 billion people in China, 1.4 billion people in India, 700 million people in Southeast Asia, ASEAN, 1.4, 0.7 comes to 3.5 billion people. Out of these 3.5 billion people, only 150 million enjoyed middle-class living standards. 150 million out of 3.5 billion in the year 2000. By 2020, that number had exploded from 150 million to 1.5 billion. And by 2030, it will be close to 3 billion people. Can you see this? In 30 years, we've gone from 150 million in the middle class to almost 3 billion by 2030. And when future historians look at our time, they say this is an amazing time to have been alive as a human being. But this is also very important news for Sri Lankans. Many of you worry about the future. It's good for you to know that 30 years ago, you were surrounded by an ocean of poverty or deprivation. Today, Sri Lanka, when this 3 billion middle class emerges, you're surrounded by an ocean of prosperity coming your way. So the opportunities for Sri Lanka today will be so much better if you're living in a sea of 3 billion middle class people around you. And that's a fundamental structural change. But yet, despite all this, we continue to be pessimistic. Why? So this brings me to my second contradiction. The second contradiction is between what I call the pessimistic West and the optimistic rest. Why is the pessimism of the West so important? It's important because it is a simple fact that for the last 200 years, human history has been driven by one dominant, powerful civilization. Western civilization. Indeed, all of us have to thank the West for having succeeded, for having launched the revolutions, the social and political revolutions, the scientific and technological revolutions, which at the end of the day lifted up Western societies first, and also we in Asia, by replicating many of these Western best practices, we have lifted ourselves first. The flush toilet, by the way, came from the West. So you can see, therefore, how the West performed has affected human history so much. And because the West was confident, happy, optimistic about the future, we were carried along by that optimism. But today, that same West, which has been so optimistic for the last 200 years, is drowning in pessimism, while many in the rest of the world are optimistic. So what's happened? And we have to understand what's happened to understand the pessimism that affects us in our lives every day. And the West, as you know, rests on two pillars, two strong pillars. One is, of course, the United States, and the other is, of course, Europe, with the core being in the European Union. And these were the two strong pillars of the West that certainly from the end of World War II to about the 1990s performed very well, did very well, and as you know, won the Cold War so handsomely in 1990. But it was that victory in the Cold War that when historians write about it, they will say that this was the moment that was actually fatal for the West. And why was it fatal for the West? Because having won this tremendous victory in the Cold War, and the West defeated the mighty Soviet Union without firing a shot. They said, okay, we have arrived. And there was a very famous essay by Francis Fukuyama called The End of History, in which he said, we in the West, we don't have to do anything. We have won. We have reached the future. We all have liberal democracies. We don't have to adjust. We don't have to adapt. It's the rest of the world that has to change and adapt. And that conviction will be seen by future historians as one of the most strategic mistakes made by the West, because what Francis Fukuyama did with that essay, The End of History, is that he put the West to sleep at precisely the moment when Asia was waking up. And Asia's waking up is so fundamental and so important because from the year 1 to the year 1820, for 1800 out of the last 2,000 years, the two largest economies of the world have always been those of China and India. And so when you have seen the last 30 years, the return of China and India, it's a perfectly normal development. I gave you the statistics already. But at precisely the moment when China and India were waking up, the West decided to go to sleep. And now, there is no question. You look at the surveys of public opinion. If you do surveys of people living in Europe or even the US, and compare that with surveys of people living in Asia, about 10% of Europeans believe that their children will have a better life than them. In the US, it's a bit better, 25-30%. But in East Asia, over 60% of people believe that their lives will be better. So clearly you see this structural change. The West has become pessimistic, and Asians have become optimistic. But getting the West out of its pessimistic depths is going to be very difficult because in their own ways, Europe and United States face serious structural challenges. And unfortunately, as of now, they don't seem to be able to find the answer. And the structural challenges are different. In the case of Europe, for example, it's very clear that because of the domestic politics of their societies, these societies are living beyond their means. Clearly, they have huge budget deficits, accumulating debts. They have to change their course of action, tell the people we have to work harder, take fewer holidays, tax you more, but no politician can do that. In fact, there's a very famous politician in Europe who said, we, the European politicians, we know what to do, but we don't know how to get elected after we do it. Right? That's the challenge for the politicians. And so Europeans, the thoughtful Europeans can see that they're losing their way, but they cannot change the course of action. And incidentally, as an aside, let me mention that the Europeans are very depressed about the war in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine was eminently avoidable. Eminently avoidable. Sadly, there were no European leaders who had the strategic sense or courage to change the course of action. And incidentally, as an aside, also let me mention that the man who gave me the insight that this war was avoidable if Europe had better leaders was Henry Kissinger, who, as you know, is one of the greatest living strategic thinkers the United States had. I had a one-on-one conversation with him in October 2022, about 1 year before he died, and after the war in Ukraine had started. And he said if only the Europeans had shown more strategic leadership and autonomy, they could have prevented this war in Ukraine. So, and the reason why this is important, remember 100 years ago, the Europeans could run the world effortlessly. Effortlessly, 100 years ago. Today, Europeans cannot run themselves. And that explains the pessimism. And just again, since I've been talking about European Union, as you know, the British used to run our part of the world. If 100 years ago, if I had come in 1925, if I had come to South Asia, 100,000 Englishmen could effortlessly rule over 300 million Indians. Think about it. Today, if the UK sent 100,000 Englishmen to run India, see what would happen. Right? It's inconceivable. But that was a reality 100 years ago. And where is UK today? Well, let me quote what Martin Wolf, the chief economics commentator of Financial Times, just a few weeks ago, he published a column in the Financial Times. And the first line said, UK has 3 failures. Failing politics, a failed state, and a failing economy. Failing politics, a failed state, and a failing economy. This was the country that could run the world. Now it cannot run itself. And that shows you, therefore, how deep the pessimism is in the West. And in the case of the United States, the problem is completely different. Now, this is a long story. The United States is a large and complex society, but functionally, the problem with the United States is that it has effectively become a plutocracy. What is a plutocracy? A plutocracy is a society where the public policy decisions are made not to benefit the masses of people, the people at the bottom 50%, but to benefit the top 1, 2, or maybe 3% of people. And it's not just me saying US has become a plutocracy. Paul Volcker, the most revered head of the Fed, Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize winner, Martin Wolf, whom I quoted earlier, said US has become a plutocracy. And when you become a plutocracy, it's very hard to change because the people with the money have developed the ability to control the political system to benefit them. And as a result of that, I told you, for example, that the last 30 years have been so wonderful for Asia. In the last 30 years, the bottom 50% of the United States has seen their standard of living stagnate for 3 to 4 decades. Now, this stagnation is extremely important to understand because it explains why Donald Trump was elected. Because there are people at the bottom who were so angry with Washington, D.C. They felt that Washington, D.C. had not helped them out at all. They wanted to elect somebody who would kick Washington, D.C. And after he kicked them once, they didn't get the message. So the people said, let's bring back Donald Trump a second time. Now, the fact that he was elected not once, but twice, is a very powerful indicator of how unhappy the people are in the United States. So you can see, therefore, that the civilization that had been the driver of growth, development for the last 200 years, Europe has lost its way, United States has lost its way, and that explains the pessimism that we feel in the world. But we therefore have to be aware of what we have accomplished. But let me now turn to my third contradiction, because this adds another layer of complexity to understanding the state of our world. And the third contradiction is between our national interests, often our short-term national interests, and our long-term global interests. Because we live in a time, and I've already told you, gave you several examples of many structural changes. But one other fundamental structural change in our global order that has happened is that we now live in a small, interdependent world. And that's a major transformation. Why is that transformation important? Let me use a simple boat analogy to explain how the world has changed. In the past, when we lived in 193 separate countries, we were separated. It was as though we were living in separate boats, right? But now the world has shrunk dramatically. And so the 193 countries are no longer 193 separate boats. They're 193 separate cabins on the same boat. Now, why is this important? Think about it. If we were separate boats, if one boat got COVID, the other 192 boats won't get COVID. There's space. But as you know, as recently as what happened 3-4 years ago, one cabin got COVID, all 193 cabins got COVID. So we are now in the same boat. Now, clearly, if we are in the same boat, the most sensible thing to do is for all of us to come together and cooperate and take care of the global boat. Right? Makes sense. There's no point taking care of your cabin if the boat is sinking. And as we know, because of climate change, our boat is being threatened. So because of climate change, we should be coming together to work together. But unfortunately, because our mindsets are stuck in some ways, not just the 19th century, but actually in the 17th century, because of the Treaty of Westphalia of 1648, which is 376 years old, we have developed the notion of national sovereignty. National sovereignty means I take care of my country, I'm sovereign in my country, you don't interfere. But it doesn't make sense anymore, sovereignty, if you're a cabin on a boat. So clearly, we as humanity must come together. But will we come together? Maybe not in the next 5-10 years. And to add another layer of complexity to what I'm talking about, I only have 5 minutes left, forgive me. I'll rush a bit. We are also, unfortunately, at our time, experiencing the largest geopolitical contest ever seen in human history. Because the contest between the world's number one power, United States, and the world's number one emerging power is going to accelerate over the next 10-20 years. And just so that you understand how crazy that is, imagine all of us, 100 of us, were on a sailing boat. And we're on the same sailing boat. We can see we are sailing into a storm, climate change. And the two best sailors, instead of focusing on how to save the boat, are fighting each other to see who's stronger. That's madness. But that's a description of our world, because the geopolitical contest will accelerate even as climate change accelerates. So clearly, if you feel in your guts that there's turbulence coming, there's a reason for that. There are many structural challenges that we face. But at the same time, I also believe that because of the spectacular improvements we have seen, because of the spread of education, because of the awareness of many people around the world, that we have to come together to deal with humanity's common challenges, especially climate change. I do believe that humanity, having succeeded so well over the last 30 years, will in some ways find ways and means of counterbalancing all the negative trends that I mentioned to you. And the good news is that many countries in Asia are actually behaving more responsibly in terms of taking care of our planet. And of course, one of them clearly is China. Now, again, if you read the Western media, you'll get only negative news about China, or China is doing terrible things. But it's quite remarkable that China, as I told you, is developing the world's largest middle class, right? Just imagine if the world's largest middle class decided to buy cars with gasoline engines instead of electric vehicles. Can you imagine what would happen to planet Earth? But luckily for us, 50% of the cars sold in China today are electric vehicles. And equally amazingly, China is actually carrying out one of the world's largest reforestation programs, and reforesting an area that could be as big as Belgium and maybe as big as Germany. So these are again examples of good news that gets drowned out in the bad news that is coming our way. So at the end of the day, I believe there's no question whatsoever that we will face serious challenges, especially as we move from one geopolitical order to a different geopolitical order. But even as we make that transition, we are also at the same time uplifting the human condition dramatically and significantly. And today, knowledge is spreading dramatically around the world. And I'm sure you're going to discuss about AI and how it will transform our lives. I do believe that as we educate humanity, as we make them more aware of what's happening in the world, at the end of the day, just as we have in the past, we will once again rise to the occasion. And 10 years from now, when I come back here, I think you will all be happier.